So I'm delighted to be with you and to have the opportunity to explore the ways we think about children and media and education and how that all relates to regulation. And recently I've been working in particular in education in early childhood and how that might work with media literacy education, and it's led me to some insights that challenge a lot. So I'm going to invite you this morning to maybe rethink a little bit of how we're framing this whole issue. And I do want to thank Digital Families and everyone who made it possible for me to be in this room with you today. So first, let me do a quick check to see where the early childhood people are in the audience, or parents maybe who have recently been raising young children. Who can tell me what this is? Raise your hand. I see a few, so shout it out. Which character of Baby Shark? Grandma Shark. So for those of you who are clueless and thinking, well, what's she doing out there? So this is the hand motion to represent Grandma Shark from Baby Shark, the video on YouTube that has, by the way, received 11 billion, that's billion with a B, 11 billion views. Now, what's interesting to me, well, there are lots of interesting things to me about that, but one of the things that's interesting to me, so very quickly, this is Grandma. Grandpa is this. What's the difference? Right, so the implication is that Grandpa is bigger, Grandma is smaller, and they repeat that for all the genders. So, and what's the difference between Grandma and Mommy is this, right? So Grandma is this, Mommy is this. And what's the implication? What's the difference here between this and this? Yes, we assume that the old folks have no teeth. So if you know anything at all about sharks, then one of the things you know is that in fact sharks never lose all of their teeth. They have hundreds of them, so you'd never run into a toothless shark. That female sharks are generally larger than male sharks. Sharks don't hang out in families. They're pretty much solo from the time they're born, and baby sharks would never hang out with their grandparents. And unlike the animated baby sharks, they aren't neon green, bright orange, or hot pink. So this is all a long way of saying misinformation starts early. Now, Baby Shark certainly is far from the most consequential example of misinformation that we might have out there, but I think it can illustrate for us how we might think about our response to misinformation. We could go to YouTube and demand that they pull down one of the most all-time popular videos on their site, because it includes misinformation. And that would be silly. In part because it doesn't do us any good to tell a child not to like what they like. And the job of an educator can't be to condemn media that children and youth treasure. So our job isn't to convince kids that Baby Sharks is bad or YouTube is a wasteland. Instead, what we can do is use a media literacy inquiry approach to add new information and perspectives that can help children think in more complex ways about the media they enjoy. So what happens is when we focus on the problems, we miss opportunities to build media literacy skills, right? If we just went to YouTube and said, take it down, and no kids ever saw the misinformation about sharks anymore, right? They would never build media literacy skills. And the ways that we build media literacy skills are, we start with questions. We would invite children to, we'd ask them, well, what do you know about sharks? Where do you think you learned that from? Or if you're watching Baby Sharks together, wow, what did you just learn about sharks? And let them tell us the meaning they're making instead of us assuming we know. I guarantee you, you don't. We don't have the same brains, we hope, as a 3 or 4-year-old, right? So we don't know what they're thinking. And then we can help them build very specific media literacy skills. So if they took away a message that was misinformation about sharks, we'd say, boy, how could we find out if that's accurate or not? And we could coach them through by narrating, well, we could go online. I'll bet even YouTube has other informational videos about sharks, and we could explain to them, you know, sometimes there's a difference between fun stuff and informational stuff. And let's see which one says what. And then let's see if we can figure out together who has the best information about sharks. And even if you decide that Baby Sharks doesn't have the best information about sharks, it doesn't mean Baby Sharks is without value. Now, I'm not going to play Baby Sharks for you. I don't want to put that earworm in your head all day long. So I'll end it there, but use that to go on to explore this kind of model of inquiry. It's never a model that will tell us that Baby Sharks is bad and that kids shouldn't watch. Now, of course, it's not all as simple as it sounds. So before I explain more, let me provide a little bit of context. We are living through an amazing time. For only the second time in human history, the concept of literacy is shifting. The first time was sparked by Gutenberg, right? Before the introduction of technologies that made mass printing possible, reading and writing was a job. It was a profession, a skill set, and usually an esteemed one. The printing press shifted our expectations over time for who should be literate. Over a couple of centuries, we went from an elite few to the expectation that we live with today, which is we assume everybody needs to become literate. The ubiquity of digital media technologies is creating a second shift. And this time, the shift is in what it actually means to be literate. Even if we limit the term literacy to the ways we communicate with symbol systems and not as a way to describe everything we need to learn, which is what it's come to be in common parlance, right? We have all kinds of literacies now. In the real world, literacy now requires much more than decoding text and writing sentences with printed words. And we'll see if they have my slides. I didn't check beforehand. In the digital world, there it is. If all you can do is read and write printed text, you're missing a lot. Consider that nearly all common information sources now merge images and often audio with printed text, even in sources that we often think of as traditional print sources, like newspapers. On social media, posts that include images attract more attention. In the political world, discourse is often via memes and not just formal debate, although your debates here are wonderfully entertaining. Our online personal accounts, if you think about all the things you do online, commonly offer us dashboards with charts and graphs rather than written reports on our information, right? So it's clear that part of literacy for the digital world is that analyzing images must be as routine as learning to decode and analyze print. When we read aloud to children, they aren't just learning about the world from the words of the story, they're learning from the images. How many city kids, for instance, develop a fear of the forest because so many of our fairy tales have these striking images of pictures of the forest where it's scary? And then we say, gosh, I wonder why they don't want to go outdoors and hang out in the forest. In film and video, children don't just learn from the story either. How many children who aren't from Africa think they know what Africa's like because they've watched The Lion King or Madagascar or Tarzan or, right, pick your popular media. And what are the consequences of letting them carry those limited visions because we don't discuss the images of the story? Even more important than technology means we have almost unfathomable access to information and audiences literally in the palms of our hands. In an online world, to make sense of what we decode and create without becoming completely overwhelmed or numb, people need logic and reasoning and discernment and evaluation skills, being able to decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. Also an understanding of how platform design, commercial structures, and repetition influence messages and interpretation. And this changing literacy is what I want to describe in the next few minutes. Imagine for a moment that our collective response to the Gutenberg shift had been different. What if, as communities began to collect, oops, that's not supposed to be next. Let's see if all right, I don't have it there. We'll skip that. What if they made a different decision than teaching children to learn and write print? What if we hadn't gone to the universal literacy version? What if instead people had chosen to devote most of their resources to keeping children safe? Because some of the ideas in the books were dangerous. They never taught most children to read or write or think about ideas. They didn't even pay much attention to who controlled the ideas, which were included or excluded from the library. Instead, they taught children strategies to keep themselves safe while in the library. Now, that may sound a little bit far-fetched, maybe even a little silly, and I don't want to stretch the metaphor too far here, but that's essentially what we do when we feel compelled to prepare the next generation for life in the digital world, but offer them almost exclusively strategies focused on how to use the technologies in ways that keep them safe. And until very recently, that's been the dominant approach to preparing the next generation for life in the digital world, especially for young children. What's happened is that many have approached what I think is best understood as an education challenge instead as a public health initiative. And that initiative is aimed at shielding children from harm. But, and this is where this should be, in real life, children aren't knights. They need more than armor and shields, and they only need fighting skills if our primary goal is to train children to approach media as their enemy. Let me be very clear here. I'm not arguing that we should abandon concerns about facets of digital technologies that run counter to our well-being. I wouldn't be a media literacy educator if I believed that there weren't real harms and valid concerns about effects. Nor will I ever suggest that media literacy is a replacement for regulation, especially when regulation is aimed at transparency and design rather than censorship. An educated public does not ever absolve media makers, owners, and platforms of their responsibility to act in the public good. What I'm suggesting is that to address our concerns about media, we need to rethink the challenge. And media makers have always known that framing matters. Some of you may be familiar with this from the Be Internet Legends curriculum. So we look at this and we're already making meaning about what is this? We're trying to figure it out. And if we change the frame, some of what we were initially thinking probably changes as well. Similarly, in education or policy, the way we frame the task shapes our responses. And public health framing treats media as if it's a disease, and the goal is to prevent children from getting sick. This particular frame limits our ability to prepare children to thrive in the real world. And let me briefly suggest 4 ways that that's true. A public health frame inherently draws our attention to the dangers of media. That's public health's kind of job, right? If media are identified as the problem, the logical response is to keep kids away, or at least minimize contact, and so we end up with screen time limits. That's the logical kind of end goal. And that's true even as study after study has shown us that, in fact, the effects of screens is much more about what people are actually doing with the screens than the amount of time that they spend. And in education, this has practical consequences. Because if we're focused on reducing screen time, it makes it difficult to help students practice the skills they need to use screens ethically, effectively, creatively, and critically, or to put it another way, we can't keep children away from screens and help them become literate at the same time any more than we can keep them away from books and expect them to become great readers. Now, of course, media and digital technologies are woven into the fabric of modern life. So many aspects of our daily lives now take place in the digital commons. And compared to the analog world, digital media is incredibly accessible. So now let me go back here since these are out of order. So you may be able to keep children away from screens, but you can't actually keep them away from the culture in which they are growing up, and it's a digital culture. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the Sesame Street song, the Who Are the People in Your Neighborhood? And that used to mean teaching the people you would see as you walked around your neighborhood. Well, the digital world takes children into a whole new neighborhood. And they're going to meet people there who we want them to meet and meet people there who maybe we don't want them to meet so much. We can limit where they're allowed to go in the neighborhood, but our goal can't be to keep them from ever being out and about. A second public health strategy has been to teach warning lessons. These help children learn to deal with or avoid obvious dangers, but they rarely help children learn to grapple with the ideas they encounter. In other words, they don't offer thinking skills. And if all we do is warn and scold, we aren't much fun, and kids aren't likely to listen. They'll spend more energy testing our rules than learning the skills that might actually help them stay safe online. Safety lessons are sometimes compared to teaching kids to cross the street, right? So we teach them the skills to cross the street so that they can venture out, and we make the streets a relatively regulated environment, right? We have crosswalks and traffic lights and stop signs and things. But the difference between how we prepare them to venture safely out their door and how we prepare them to be safe online is that we generally approach learning to cross the street as a good thing. We want them to be out and about and safe in their neighborhood. Versus online, where an awful lot of adults approach this task as if they don't really want their children to be there, but if they have to, well, then here are some rules. And children sense our emotions and our motives as much, if not more, than they're listening to our words. They're much more likely to absorb lessons that come from a place of imagination and discovery. And a third result of the public health frame is what we choose to research. And I'll just spend a second here. In a public health frame, most of the funding goes to media effects research because our job is to identify what's dangerous, right? Even though we know from effects research that, in fact, most of the studies will result in one version or another of, well, it depends. It depends on who the person is, and it depends on what they're actually doing or viewing. So I'll take all that money instead, if you want to. Or better yet, how about devoting a significant portion of it to education research, and let's find out what actually helps children develop lifelong media and digital literacy skills. And if we can't quite get there, let's at least require effects researchers to use media literacy as a variable. What we do now is akin to researching the effects of books without ever asking if the people who are the subjects of our research can read. Asking whether research subjects have been taught to use media literacy skills would help advance the field because it would require researchers to develop definitions and assessments to determine whether a child possessed media literacy skills, knowledge, or dispositions. And lastly, safety strategies are focused on the now, when, in fact, as Vicki just said, what we need to do is future-proof. Now, I think one of the reasons we've been so distracted by the public health approach is that the mainstream media primes the general public with sensationalized reporting on media effects research. Very few people beyond the research community or policy community read the actual studies. What they know, or think they know, comes from people describing the research. Bloggers, journalists, pundits, even entertainers, right? Or their friend posting on social media. And because profit structures reward clicks and likes, sensationalism often obscures accuracy. So, it's going to be a lot more popular online to say, oh my God, the technology is turning babies into zombies, than it is to say, actually, the research is pretty nuanced. Not a really enticing headline if what you want is clicks. So I'm going to suggest that rather than framing the challenge as one of danger and safety, what if we reframe the challenge as illiteracy? This reframe doesn't mean we abandon things like media management strategies. Media management are the rules that we set, mostly adults setting them to govern access and content, right? When and for how long and what children are permitted to do with media devices. And media management, absolutely, especially in families, is going to continue to be important. But if we don't distinguish between media management and media literacy, we end up with families who set media rules, thinking they're raising media literate kids, even though they're doing all the work and children never develop the skill sets they need to begin to manage media for themselves. So let's be clear that the goal is more important than media literacy. More important than media management. The purpose of media literacy education is to develop habits of inquiry and skills of expression for these particular goals, to be lifelong learners, critical and creative thinkers, effective communicators, and engaged ethical community members and citizens. And if we were kind of programming a media literacy GPS, this would be our destination. And then we do a little bit of research to figure out what our starting location is, and then we can begin to map out the steps to get there. That's, I think, what we need to focus on. If the goals are habits of inquiry and skills of expression, it's easy to see why safety isn't enough. It's because safety doesn't give kids the skills they need to navigate the digital commons and process what they find there or participate ethically or effectively in the communities offered by digital media technologies. And it's easier to understand if we think of media literacy as a comprehensive skill set. The gears represent each skill area. Note that inquire and reflect are larger and at the center. They're all included in everything we do. I depict them as gears because gears are interconnected and each loses power if they aren't linked to the others. They do very little in isolation. And what's happened is that most safety approaches are very good, actually, at addressing the access competency. But access is one of 10. And in isolation, access just doesn't get us very far. And I think that's where we're getting stuck. We can do all this great access stuff, and if we're not addressing the 9 other competencies, we're not going to end up with the digitally literate citizenry that we need. We don't just want children to know how to use the technology. We don't just want them to be better or safer media users. What we want is for them to be better thinkers. And that's why inquire and reflect are so central to media literacy competencies. So I've got a couple minutes here to explain the whole thing of how we do that. There are, of course, hundreds of strategies. Media literacy analysis is a common starting place. This is not about telling children what media mean. Media literacy analysis isn't about showing children what they missed by pointing out what we notice. It's about asking them what they notice and helping them build the skills they need to see more. And the primary way we do that is by teaching them to ask questions about the media they use and create. It's not a set list of questions. Some of you, if you're familiar with media literacy education, might have seen sets. Some have 5 questions, some have 7, some have 8. That's old school media literacy. Instead, we teach question categories. And it's important to frame it as categories because categories let us adapt the words to the situations that we have. So things like, what's the purpose, which I already have a problem with because it's not plural, and very often there's more than one purpose. But what's the purpose is too hard for a 3 or 4-year-old to answer. It's not concrete enough. So we might ask them, well, what does this want me to do? Right. And notice that I phrase it in the personal because our goal isn't for us to ask the questions all the time. It's to teach children to ask the questions for themselves. That's the habit that we want to instill. We start with I wonder because we pose questions as conversation starters, not as a quiz with single correct answers. So the wording can end up being all kinds of things, right? A target audience question can end up being things like, would your sister think this is funny? Right? That's a target audience question. It is a valid, actually complex media literacy question. And we almost never teach kids in our current context to ask it. The other thing we do is we ask questions in strings. So it's not just a I ask, you answer, call and response kind of thing. It's we ask a question and then we do follow-up prompts like, how do you know? Or what makes you say that? And it's not the, well, what makes you say that? It's not a challenging follow-up. It's, an inviting curiosity. What makes you say that? Boy, that's really interesting, right? And we can integrate those questions into existing routines. For example, I teach early childhood educators to do this when they're reading aloud to children. Most early childhood educators ask children predictive questions. So what do you think is going to happen next as they're holding up the book and kids are watching? And they take a few answers from the kids. And then they say, okay, let's find out. If they pause there for 20 seconds to ask the child who responds, so what did you see in the picture that made you think that? That's a media literacy question, and it teaches them to attach their answers to evidence, right? There are lots of ways we can do this without adding tons and tons of time, either to family life or to school curriculum. In fact, in media literacy education, most of what we do is asking, not telling. And there are some specific ways that we do this. The first is that we're going to start with the very youngest children because that's where habits start. And in early years, habits are far more important than right answers. We just want them to know that talking about and thinking about media is just what people do, that it would be weird to encounter or create media and not ask questions. And we talk about media not as some zero competition game. This isn't about me proving I'm right and that your interpretation, whatever it is wrong. And that also becomes obvious if you're working with young children because a 3-year-old is almost never going to interpret the same way that you do. And yet we don't think our primary job is to teach them that they're wrong and that we're right? We don't get in some zero competition argument with them. Instead, what we do, and media literacy models this throughout the lifespan, we try to understand the meaning that others are making, and then we remember that the ultimate goal isn't for us to ask questions and children to answer. It's what we want to do is engage them in these conversations so that they're asking questions for themselves because those questions are the ways that we learn about each other, right? Media literacy can provide us the beginnings of dialogue across incredible differences as long as we have evidence as that common ground. And if we're teaching them to attach answers to evidence from day one, essentially, just as routine, this is just what people do, we can get there. Now, one caution here. Traditional pedagogies in which adults are the experts with all the answers and children are only rarely required to do any intellectual seeking of their own are more likely to instill obedience than critical thinking. In such systems, children learn to trust authorities instead of developing and ultimately trusting their own skills and judgments. It's a trap that can appear to be successful as long as everybody follows authorities that merit our approval. And when we see adults who seemingly blindly follow sources that they've decided are trustworthy, rather than continue to ask questions because even trustworthy sources are wrong sometimes, we're looking at the results of what our current approach to media literacy education has taught them to do. Just find a trusted source and distinguish them from those who mislead. And then we're done. So the last thing we want to do is accustom children to rely on others to interpret media for them. Ultimately, what we want is for inquiry to become automatic, like reading. Once you learn how to read, you can't ever look at the printed text and not see words. Your brain won't let you. It's the opposite of mindless, right? Sometimes we think, oh, a habit is just mindless. I just do it without thinking. Actually, what we want is for the thinking to become the mindless habit, right? That it's that automatic. We want it to be everyone's default setting. And then we can help children learn to notice the media in their environment and invite them to think about what those media are saying to them and why. Theologian Mary Daly used to write the word disease as dis-ease, noting that sometimes being sick was evidence of a state of discomfort with reality as much as it was any specific biological cause. And perhaps in this view, those who take a public health approach to digital technology are not altogether wrong. Living through major societal change, as we all are, is unsettling. And we're less than 20 years into an era of widespread availability of digital media devices. So we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves if we haven't figured it all out yet. After all, we've been reading print for several hundred years, and we still argue about the best ways to teach reading and ensure that everyone learns how. So we're in uncharted territory, and as scary as that can be, it also suggests that there are exciting new things to discover. We can approach digital media technologies with fear or with imagination. I vote for the latter. So I invite you to imagine what it would look like to base policies and practice on creating a culture in which inquiry is celebrated, universal, and routine. We create culture mostly with the things that we do every day, not just with separate lessons. In British schools, we commonly have referred to this in the past as media education. I've purposely used media literacy because we understand literacy is throughout the curriculum. That's what I want us to think of, that it's infused into all parts of school, all parts of life, every grade level, every subject, every area. What I'm suggesting is that rather than teaching children to be media literate, our goal is to help children become literate in the digital, media-rich world they actually live in. We should feel compelled to embrace media literacy education because our collective job is to prepare children for their digital future, not our analog past, even if our education systems were designed for that past and reflect its priorities. So, back to baby sharks. They say you can stop an earworm by replacing it with a mantra or a phrase repeated several times. So for any of you that still have a slightly annoying preschool song featuring sharks in your head, let me end with the way blogger Mitra Martin summarized my thinking about children and media. End the guilt, start the education. End the guilt, start the education. Thank you.